I'm just wondering if there was any water anywhere. I'm okay at the moment, but I'm aware that I've been singing.
Shall I get
Yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you, Mark. Interestingly topical, Emily talking about sickness in pregnancy. In case the news hasn't spread, our daughter Lucy is expecting, and she's been unusually sick. And just a week or so ago, she discovered she's having twins. So figured out maybe that's why she's been so sick. So we're looking forward to grandchildren number 6 and 7 in April, if all's well. Okay, well, what could be better than freedom? What could be better than freedom? It's where Peter starts his little discussion in this passage. I was reading just yesterday in the news a report from Ukrainian. Thank you, Mark. I'll have a swig now.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Ukrainian soldiers who are saying we're ready to die for our country. We're ready to die to liberate our country. Even if Putin uses nuclear weapons, it makes no difference to us if we die one way or another. We're here to liberate our country. It's just such an important thing for us. The breath of freedom. When Mandela was in jail for 27 years in South Africa, 27 years, 18 of which were on Robben Island, the famous Robben Island. And imagine the sense of freedom when you walk out of the prison and breathe in the fresh air of South Africa. I'm sure it's probably fresher there than it is here. In February 1990, when Mandela walked out of I forget the name of the prison, Verster prison. The taste of freedom is beautiful, isn't it? It's just such an important thing for us as human beings. The taste and delight of freedom. What could be more important? That's the question that Peter addresses in this passage. What could be more important? Challenge we're surrounded by Ukrainians in our community here, and we have one in church this morning. We all hope and pray that the freedom will come, that we'll get there. But if and when it comes, there's going to be a new challenge, isn't there? How do Ukrainians and collaborators live together in the streets as neighbours? It's happened in the Balkans. We had a Serbian in our house recently who said, when I'm back in Serbia, my wife won't drive through Croatia because it's just not worth it. It's not worth it because of the hassle she'll get from being a Serbian in Croatia. It just ricochets year after year. It's the tragedy of what Putin has done in Ukraine is that he's wreaked destruction for years to come. And Peter is addressing this issue. He addresses it on a macro scale and then on a micro scale. He addresses it. He talks about the authorities, the empire, how we should respond to them, and he talks about it in the home, particularly around the area of slaves and masters and husbands and wives. Very controversial kind of passage, isn't it? But that's the setting that he is in. Freedom, says Peter, is beautiful. He doesn't actually say that, he implies it though. Freedom is beautiful, but submission, says Peter, is powerful. And submission is the key weapon in the battle for health and healing and restoration, he says. Freedom is beautiful, but submission is powerful. The word submit appears several times in this passage. It's important we step back and set the scene culturally as to what's going on. Remember Paul's words, one of the earliest letters in the New Testament to be written, Galatians. And in Galatians, Paul says, remember, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, slave nor free. A social revolution has been taking place. The Christians are bringing it about. And within Christendom, these fundamental distinctions in society, I mean, these household rules, slaves and masters, wives and husbands, the hierarchies that were established within the household were absolutely fundamental to the working of the empire. They regarded this as the basic unit of how the empire was constructed, we're talking about here. And these hierarchies are being dismantled by social, cultural upheaval. This letter is being written in the midst of that upheaval, as these distinctions are being broken down. Paul writes a letter to Philemon on the other side of the fence. He's writing to Philemon, who's a master, a slave master, about his runaway slave Onesimus. Tom Wright thinks that Onesimus has probably been given his freedom. It's a moot point. We don't quite know. He's either a runaway slave or he's a runaway sort of freedman, which would be more like a runaway employee as we would see it today. But anyway, he's gone off, he's spent time with Paul, and he's being sent back with Paul. And Paul says to Philemon, receive Onesimus as a brother, he says. That's quite a hard thing for a slave master to hear and grapple with. I mean, these days we take it for granted. Slavery is bad, isn't it? But here we were on the cusp of a massive upheaval when slave masters were having to get it into their heads that this slave, or possibly this ex-slave, is my brother. We are brothers in Christ. And that's the context into which Peter is writing as well. One where distinctions have been broken down. So what does Peter have to say? He says, in the process of gaining your freedom, when you discover that Jesus is for you, that he loves you, that I am a child of God, that I have an inheritance preserved for me in heaven, when I am loved beyond all worlds, when you discover the freedom that you are a tremendously valuable individual, then you start to find a new power, and it's the power of submission. Peter specifically says, he says, live as free people, but don't use your freedom as an excuse for evil, he says. Use your freedom well. Use it strategically. And he comes up with this weird strategy, this weird tactic. He says, those of you who now realise that the hierarchies of male and female, slave and master, these have all been disintegrated, pretend that they're not. He says, submit. I mean, I was struck afresh as Mark read the passage there. Peter really hammers it home, doesn't he? About the wives, acknowledge the authority of your husbands. And he hammers it home. He having recognised that you are free to do absolutely anything you want because you are now children of the King, do it anyway. Why? Because it's powerful. Now, I want to make a very clear distinction between two sorts of submission. Submission born out of fear and submission born out of freedom. They're two very different animals. Submission born out of fear is bad. It's destructive. We call it abuse. Women cowed by their husbands so they feel they have no choice at all. No choice but to do what their husbands want because they're scared stiff of being beaten up every day. That kind of submission is unhealthy. You may need to get right out of that kind of relationship if that's what's going on. It's not the submission that Peter is talking about here. Peter starts with freedom and says, don't use your freedom for evil. Now, submit, he says. Submit. Why? Because submission is good. What is submission? Submission is just doing what you want instead of what I want. Thinking how to please you rather than how to please me. That's submission. And now should we only do this with people, as Christians, we're all kind of nice now, aren't we? We're all kind of palsy-walsy together. So this is easy in the church, isn't it? submitting to one another because we all love one another, don't we? Well, actually, Peter says even submit even when your husbands are harsh, he says, so that they may be won by your gentle and respectful behaviour, or whatever it is, something like that. How do I know that submission is not only for when people are nice to us? It's also, so the distinction is not between, do I submit when people are brutal and abusive, or only when they're kind of reasonably nice people? The distinction is, do I submit out of fear or out of freedom? It's very different. How do I know that it's okay to submit when people are harsh and brutal? How do I know that? It's not a rhetorical question. You can answer it if you want. How do I know that that is a constructive thing to do? You're all looking blank at me, stunned into silence. It's what Jesus did on the cross. It's what Jesus did. It's exactly what Jesus did. Jesus, the freest person who's ever lived. Jesus, God on earth, he can do what he wants. Chooses to submit to abuse. Now that may sound like a dangerous thing to say, to suggest it's okay to submit to abuse. But it's only okay if you do it with utter freedom and utter choice. It's only okay if it's born out of choice, agency, a free decision to do that. Because I think in this situation, this is going to potentially show love to that person and maybe win them over. Maybe win them over. That makes sense. You're not sure. But it's what Jesus did. It's undoubtedly what Jesus did. So, there's a story when Mandela came out of prison in February 1990. 4 years later, he was elected the first black president of South Africa. And one of the first things he did when he walked into the, I'm not sure what they call it, equivalent to the White House, he met and shook hands with the former head of security, who was ready to hand him the keys, Rory Stain. And he immediately said to Rory, well, you've served my predecessor, F.W. de Klerk. Will you serve me as my head of security? A white guy protecting a black man in South Africa. And Rory said it will be an honour. And the two of them had a fantastic relationship from then on. But there's Mandela, who finally gets his freedom, finally has all the power. And what does he do? He says, Rory, I'd like to submit to you, a white guy, as my head of security. I'd like you to take charge of that, and I'll do what you tell me in matters of security. Such a powerful thing to do, and Mandela was so good at doing that. Mandela had this phrase, keep your friends close and your enemies closer, he said. And he was always bringing people around him, making friends with those who might be perceived as his enemies. Well, Rory Stain was never really his enemy, but he was certainly on the other side of the fence. He was white. F.W. de Klerk, the previous white South African president, whom Mandela took over from, becomes Mandela's first deputy. De Klerk actually submits too. He submits to this black man's leadership. Such a powerful thing. Now, South Africa hasn't been without its problems, but they have been able to rebuild their country, to transform their country and to dismantle the structural apartheid. I'm sure there's discrimination that goes on still all over the place, but they've won through. They've not just experienced the beauty of freedom, but they've experienced the power of submission, the power of actually exercising grace and submitting to one another, when naturally they just want to say, okay, time for revenge. Now we're in power. No, that's not what they're doing. Bringing it right home to roost in the home, which is where Peter focuses, right there in the home. We can do it too. the exercise of submission. It looks as though Peter is trying to maintain hierarchies here. I think it's just that Paul has pointed us off in a certain direction, but it's going to take an awful long time to get there. And in the meantime, we mustn't forget that submission is the way of Jesus. Submission is a powerful tool in the battle of building health and healing and reconciliation, rather than destruction and hatred and revenge, which is what it would look like if we use our freedom as an excuse for evil. I hope and pray that Ukraine will be liberated, and I hope and pray that Ukrainians and indeed Russians will somehow find the way to experience healing and reconciliation in the future. But I hope and pray that we'll do it in our own homes as well. Amen. God bless you.